Muy buenas tardes, o día o noche, dependiendo de la situación. Estamos aquí los profesores Pedro, Rosario y Barbosa de la Universidad de Puerto Rico en Calle. Eh, Estoy en compañía grata con Adrián Pérez del Búho de Minerva. Saludos.
Un
Y estoy
saludo.
aquí con el doctor Pérez y Allison Jr., una de las más grandes eminencias en cuanto al Jesús histórico y temas relacionados con el Nuevo Testamento.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for...
Dr. Allison.
Hello, everybody. We have a very special guest today with us. This is Professor Dale Allison. You probably already know about him, but still, I'm going to introduce him. Professor Allison has a PhD in religion from Duke University, and he's one of the probably the best, well-known and most well-respected scholars regarding the historical Jesus and the origins of Christianity that is alive today. So it's a very great honor and a great pleasure for us to have you here, Dr. Allison.
Happy to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about the resurrection of Sorry, Pedro, did you say something?
No, go ahead.
Sorry about that, folks. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Professor Allison has written perhaps the greatest book on the topic. So it's an amazing opportunity here to explore some of the themes that were explored in that work. Professor, before we delve into the topic in itself, we want to ask you a somewhat personal question. What drove you to write a book specifically on the resurrection of Jesus of all topics?
Well, this is a topic I've been interested in literally for decades, and this goes back to the 1970s, to when I was in college, and I read some of the literature on the resurrection that was written back then, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. I was left with all sorts of questions. Then when I wrote my first book, which was based on my doctoral dissertation, which came out in the 1980s, I actually had a long excursus at the end on the origin of belief in the resurrection. But even though it was a long excursus, it was just a little part of the book. And then in 2000, I believe it was 2005, somewhere around in there, I wrote a very long essay on this topic, and that got a lot of attention, but I wasn't happy with it, and it received criticism. So I thought, well, why not? I'll just now address this subject in a book. It'll give me a chance to update and revise what I think. It'll give me a chance to answer my critics about this and that. And it'll give me a chance to add some things that I have discovered along the way. So the truth is that I am a Christian, but I'm also a person of doubt. And I'm confused about all sorts of things. And so I don't approach the topic of the resurrection as a skeptic, but I don't approach it as an apologist. I also don't approach it as somebody who already knows what he's going to think before he looks at all the arguments. And some of my conclusions are modest. Some of my conclusions are conservative. Some of them don't fit a conservative point of view. So I don't know how to pigeonhole myself. I don't know how to classify myself, except to say that all aspects of this topic have fascinated me for a long, long time. And this latest book, which, by the way, somebody told me last week has been translated into Spanish. I don't know much about this, but somebody said it had been. I don't know if you know anything about that, but somebody told me it had been. Anyway.
I don't. It's very interesting, yes.
Well, anyway, it's just one of those subjects that never let go of me. And so I would think about it and then write and then realize, no, I need to say more. So that's a short answer. Just always there and always bothering.
Pedro,
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. That I think that yes, I've seen your book translated in Spanish somewhere, but it has been
Okay.
translated.
Okay.
The thing is, you touched on many topics and so thoroughly that I really admired the book the way you have written it. But I want to ask you about, and we want to ask you about specific subjects regarding the book. The first one we want to address is the empty tomb narrative or the narratives.
Uh-huh.
What do you think about it in general?
So I think that the narratives that we have are a mixture of memory and fiction. So, for example, I think that the story of the guards in the Gospel of Matthew is fictional. I think it's a later development. And I think that's true of other details in the stories. But my argument is in the book that the different accounts probably go back to a memory. And by the way, I hope that I'm appropriately cautious along the way. So I say at one point that I think that the tomb was empty, but I make sure there's a probably in there. I'm not certain about this. And I think that if you're honest, there are reasons on both, to take a position that's skeptical or to take a more conservative or traditional stance. There are decent arguments on both sides. So what you have to do is you have to line up the arguments and weigh them, and then if you make a decision, do so with some humility. But I think the story of the empty tomb, this is my best guess, is sort of like the baptism. So I think Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, but I don't think there was a public voice from heaven. I don't know what to make of the dove. I don't think that there was a conversation between John the Baptist and Jesus, as you have in Matthew, where John says, no, I don't want to baptize you. And Jesus says, yeah, let's fulfill all righteousness. So what I see is an historical event, and then there is theological overlay. And then at some point, there are also legends or developments of the story that's already in place. I think that's probably what you have with the empty tomb. I would say that I'm more confident about the baptism than the empty tomb, but I think it's basically the same sort of story. The story that Mark has, Mark 16, 1-8, has been rewritten and developed and added to by Matthew and Luke and John. None of them were satisfied with it in the form that it is now. And I think in part because it has a memory and is not yet developed in the way that the later accounts are. It's not full of apologetical motifs that are useful for defending the faith. Those come in Matthew, those come in Luke, those come in John, but they're not there in Mark yet.
Skeptics have made a very big deal out of the issue that Paul does not mention the empty tomb, but you don't seem to think that that's a pretty convincing argument, right?
So I would say that most of the things we know about Jesus, Paul doesn't say anything about. Paul doesn't say Jesus was an exorcist. I'm sure Jesus was an exorcist. Paul doesn't say Jesus was a healer. I am sure Jesus was a healer. Paul says nothing about Pontius Pilate in the authentic letters, but I'm pretty sure Jesus was executed by order of Pontius Pilate. So what I'm trying to say here is that most of the stuff in the Gospels is not in Paul. And so to say, well, this isn't in Paul, right? This isn't in Paul, isn't to settle an argument. It's to introduce an interesting observation. The people who make the argument you just set forth will also say, well, Paul's arguing about the resurrection, so if he had known about the empty tomb, then he would have, made this clear. But I personally think that his words within a Jewish context, and remember, he's an ex-Pharisee or a Pharisee, his words in context imply an empty tomb. I don't think there is such a thing in Judaism as a resurrection without a tomb. That is certainly the dominant idea. Maybe there's a text or two you can ask or wonder about, but the dominant idea is resurrection. So Paul is trying to spiritualize resurrection as much as possible, but I personally think his point of departure is resurrection in a Jewish context. And resurrection in the Jewish context was always bones and earth and empty graves and so on. It's Ezekiel 37. That's a resurrection text by the first century. And Jews have, down through the centuries, as have Christians, understood this very literally. Paul is not as literal about this as some people, but I personally think he still assumes an empty tomb, even though he doesn't narrate it. But then the later creeds don't narrate this either. The people who wrote the Apostles' Creed obviously knew the stories in the Gospels, but they're not giving you any details about them. And that doesn't prove they didn't know them. They obviously did.
It's interesting nowadays. My sense is that most Christians don't think of the afterlife as an embodied afterlife. They usually think of the soul going to heaven, and they think that Jesus' resurrection was sort of a one of a kind of thing. But that's absolutely not what the New Testament is trying to imply. The idea here is that Jesus is the first fruits, and that he's sort of the first taste of what's going to happen to everybody.
Yeah, I think that's undoubtedly the case. So if you look at the history of the doctrine of the resurrection, I don't think the book has been written on this yet. There's something really interesting that happens beginning with the Enlightenment, and Christians begin to diminish as much as possible the physical continuity between the current body and the future body. And some of them will eventually talk about, well, there are just some little parts of the brain maybe that supply the continuity. But by the time you get to the 20th century, you have a conservative like C.S. Lewis talking about the old doctrine of resurrection and how nobody believes that anymore. There are lots of really interesting reasons for this. One of the things is Lewis is living after the First World War, and lots of the young men, they were all men, almost all men at that time, who went off to war. Let's say the British soldiers who went off to war, many of them didn't come back. And there were no bodies that came back. They were simply blown to bits and then thrown into piles. And so you had to separate your loved one and your hope for a loved one from a local grave or from having a corpse or anything like that. Anyway, there are lots of interesting things that go into this, like organ transplant and the history of cremation. But anyway, this history has not been written. But what happens is, beginning in the 18th century especially, people begin to have doubts about the old robust notion that, you actually have graves that will open on resurrection morning and corpses will get out and they'll somehow be reconstructed and so on. But that is the dominant belief of the church fathers. And I would guess that it was probably the belief of most early Christians. I think Paul is fighting a bit against that. I think Paul has a little different view, but I still don't think he's completely free of the notion of some sort of continuity. Remember, Paul will talk about a seed and a tree. There's still some sort of continuity there between the seed and the tree. It's just that it's radically transformed. So I'm certainly familiar with the arguments from 1 Corinthians 15, but I'm not persuaded by them.
Do you think that the reason why Paul has spiritualized in a way the idea of resurrection has to do with his vision of the risen Jesus, or is that just a different? There's a different theological explanation of why he's doing that.
Well, so that might be part of it, but you also have to remember that there are some suggestions in Judaism already of a very radical transformation. So some people read into Daniel 12 the notion of astral immortality and think that already the book of now this is controversial. I think it's probably the right reading, but read into Daniel the notion that resurrection becomes astral immortality, which is a sort of glorious transformation into something else. There's also a book written at the end of the first century, a Jewish book called Second Baruch, which has a really interesting story of the resurrection, in which the bodies come back, but then they are transformed and become angelic-like creatures. So they start with a very literal resurrection, but soon enough they are transformed into something more. So there may be something in Paul's Jewish background that's pushing him in this direction. His vision of Jesus might play a role, but I also think that it's likely that the Corinthians may have pushed him in this direction. So 1 Corinthians is always a puzzle. What is it that they're doubting? These are Christians. Paul converted them, right? He's the one who showed up in Corinth. It's his church. These are his people. He preached Jesus rose from the dead. How can they not believe in the resurrection? If I had to guess, by the way, this is just an educated guess, but if I had to guess, they didn't have any trouble with Jesus rising from the dead, because he's in the tomb on Friday and he's gone by Sunday. So you're not dealing with decaying corpses and rotting flesh and worms and all that sort of thing. There are actually some Greek and Roman stories about heroes who, are translated to heaven upon death. So this wouldn't have been foreign to them. I think what would have been foreign to them and weird is the notion that people who have been in the grave for 50 years or 100 years or 500 years are going to come back, because those people are just rotted. There's, nothing there, or there's just bones, or there are worms. And Paul is trying to say, I think, that that's not what this is about. This isn't about decaying flesh. This isn't about zombies. All right. It's not about zombies. And the people in Corinth are thinking, we don't want to be zombies. What is this? Right. And so Paul's stuck because of his Jewish background and his Christian background with the language of resurrection, but he doesn't want zombie land. So he comes up with this wonderful chapter where he's, sort of in the middle. He's trying to spiritualize as much as possible, but he still wants it to be resurrection. So there's still some sort of continuity there.
Yes, I wanted to say something. One of the most one of those research one of the research that I think is very important in recent years has been on the notion of the pneuma, of the pneuma, not spirit in the Platonic sense, but in the Stoic sense. That is, there is materiality in the spiritualization, and this corresponds to this sort of cosmology that conceives pure pneuma like an ethereal substance that you can find in stars, etc. So for even in First Thessalonians, you can find a little bit of Stoic physics that when people resurrect and the the flesh is become a pneumatic body for those who are living, they will be lifted up to receive Christ in the air.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting that Paul integrates his Judaism with what is Stoic physics. I don't know what you think about that kind of research.
Well, so I don't know if you're familiar with an American scholar. He died recently named Dale Martin, but he wrote a really important
Yes.
book which addressed this issue. And he convinced a lot of people, excuse me, and I think he may well have been on the right track here. Unfortunately, Paul, as with almost everything in Paul, says a few things and then goes on to the next subject. 1 Corinthians 15 is long, but it's not long enough for me. I wish he had said a lot more, right? But yes, this is a real possibility. And what's maybe most important is that we need to make sure when we're reading these ancient texts that we're not reading our own ideas back into them. So we shouldn't be reading, if a text talks about stars, we shouldn't be reading our ideas of stars back into the text.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing is true with, soul and body language and so on. And the Stoic material is a way of reminding us, oh, this is a way some people thought, and maybe Paul thought like this, and it's not the way we think, right? So it's really important to try to do this historically. And again, I think there probably is something to that.
Wonderful.
One of the arguments that I've read against the idea of the empty tomb is that there are some pretty, at least on its face, some pretty good Greco-Roman parallels of the idea of an empty tomb. What would you say about that?
I would say there are very interesting Greco-Roman parallels, and they are known to, let's say, Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, and he recognizes that there are similarities. And I think that is the best argument against the empty tomb, is that the ancients were capable of creating stories which involve people disappearing at or near death. And that's one argument on the side against the side I'm taking, and it is one reason why I don't want to be confident or sure about this. Why I want to be humble about it. I think there are arguments, obviously, on the other side, but that's not a bad argument. I just have to be honest. It's not a bad argument. If you want to address it, you just have to give the point that people are capable of inventing stories in which heroes disappear shortly after death. The Christians did this also. The Christians did this with their own figures beginning in the 2nd century. There are legends about, I think John the Baptist's father. Anyway, there are legends about John the son of Zebedee. There are legends about others which were, in fact, made up. So, yes, you got to be honest about these things. Sure. I actually think that's the best argument against the historical memory for the empty tomb. I would say, I don't want to get into the details of arguing this, but I do think that you're going to have to explain Mark's account primarily in terms of Judaism. Now, the Greco-Roman world is influencing Jewish thinking and Jewish texts and so on, but I think Mark's text can be understood and should be understood, first of all, out of a primarily Jewish background of resurrection of the body.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. The thing is that I'm a skeptic. I'm a militant skeptic. But I'm not as militant, as to deny other possibilities. But at least there is Mark definitely comes from a Jewish background because it uses the Septuagint and it uses a lot of data regarding Judaism. But we often forget and tend to divorce Mark from the Greco-Roman world, and we forget that Mark was written in Greek. Something as simple as that. And when you see, for example, the case of the second king of the Romans, Norman Pompilius, whose grave was discovered. They tried to open it, and they opened it, and the body wasn't there, and they assumed that he became a god. You know,
Mhm.
or certain novels that they discover that the body is not there. And they say, "Oh my God, my wife has become a god." And the way that it is narrated without completely denying, again, you're completely right about probabilities, but the thing is that the way this story has been shaped, it might evoke in the mind of any pagan reader, the thing that Jesus became a deity of some sort. you
Mhm.
know
Well, I think you're right. I'm not going to disagree with that. I also think that may well have been how the Corinthians heard Paul when he talked about Jesus being resurrected, and that was okay with them. What wasn't okay was all these graves that have been full for years and years and years, and something happening to them. That's not what the stories of assumptions are about. That's not what happens to Heracles or Romulus and so on. So, yeah, I agree with you. And if that's all I had, I would say, yeah, that will carry the day. In the book, I said I think there are other arguments on the other side. Also, I don't know how to fit this in here, but I do. It is important, maybe, to observe that there were empty graves as a matter of fact. That is, there were graves that were robbed, bodies were taken. There is a literature on this phenomenon. Sometimes it happens in Roman novels where people who need bodies for recipes, so-called witches will steal a body. The magical papyri have recipes which require that you have pieces of corpses and so on. We have some legislation against stealing bodies. We have graves that curse people who come in and take things out. So all that is to say is we do have stories of missing bodies that are fictional or legendary or mythical, but we also have real missing bodies too, right? And so you can then ask the historical question of the Gospels, leaving aside the question of God and divine agency and all that. Is there any reason to think this particular tomb was empty? That's all. Just as you might some other tomb that was robbed.
One theory I haven't really heard it being discussed very much is, isn't it possible that assuming a naturalistic explanation of the empty tomb, that it was simply the Romans that in Saturday they decided just to complete the job, and because there's the idea of that Jesus' burial might not have been thought as permanent. Joseph of Arimathea might not have might just been the member of the Sanhedrin in charge of burying crucified bodies, and maybe he just ran out of time and placed the body in a tomb, and maybe the next day on Saturday during Sabbath, Romans decided let's just finish the job and dispose of the body. Is that a reasonable theory, or is there?
Well, it's a possibility, but you have lots and lots of possibilities here. For me, it's always a question of trying to come up with what's more probable. And if I were to come up with something more probable than what you just said, I would revert back to what I was talking about earlier. We do know that tombs were robbed, and what I would say is, well, if you take the story, take the gist of the story in Mark as historical, the story would be that the tomb was emptied at night because it's empty by the time morning comes. That would fit with robbers. Robbers aren't going to rob this in the middle of the day. Also, the stone is left open. Robbers are going to leave the stone open because they're in a hurry to get the heck out of there. So what I did in the book is, despite being a Christian, I tried to come up with the best alternative scenario, and it was a grave robbery scenario. And I don't think the apologists have paid sufficient attention to it. What they will say always is, well, it's highly unlikely, how likely it is that, that Jesus's tomb was robbed. But of course, the skeptics' response to that is, well, it's more probable than a resurrection from the dead, right? So anyway, I think the best explanation for the empty tomb, if you think it's historical and you don't want to invoke divine agency, is to think that people wanted the body for this reason or that reason. Again, in the magical papyri, a special value is added to people who have died before their time, who have died executed, and so on. His body would have qualified for several of these recipes. All right. So you can't prove anything, but if you're a skeptic, I think that's a reasonable scenario.
Another argument that I find it very interesting now on the other side of the debate is that if the empty tomb is an invention, then why would you put it in the mouths of women who were at the time in that context were seen as unreliable witnesses? So there's some weight to the argument.
So that's not the conclusive argument that apologists think it is, but I still think it has weight. You have to. I think I go on for 10 or 15 pages about this in the book and weigh the different arguments on both sides. At the end of the day, I do think if this were a pure invention, that you would probably have this discovered by Peter, James, and John, or by the 12 disciples, or something like that. I do think that the New Testament is patriarchal. I think women are marginalized in multiple ways. Women are not the centers of stories in the way that men are, and I think there's something to this. Here's the other thing: this actually just fits with the rest of what I think I know. So let's say you think you know enough to believe that Jesus went to Jerusalem. There was a historical Jesus, and he went to Jerusalem. And he went with Galilean compatriots. And among those were some females. All the Gospels agree on that the crowd that went with Jesus included women. Now, if he is executed, that is a public event. In fact, the Romans want this to be as public as possible. That's the point of a crucifixion. You put it in a public place, so you say, don't do this, or you'll end up like this person. So the point was to draw crowds, and the women who knew Jesus would have been in the crowds. They would have watched him. I think it would be natural for them to have seen where he was buried. By the way, Jerusalem in the first century is very, very small. And if you look at the traditional site of the crucifixion and the traditional site of the burial, they're just a stone's throw away from each other if you go to Jerusalem. And they probably aren't that far off. The two might actually be the right place. Anyway, it would have taken no effort at all. And they would have seen what happened. And then it's totally a part of human nature to go back to graves and to mourn. I don't know about you all, but when a friend or a loved one dies, you may go to the grave afterwards for a little while. As time goes on, you visit the grave less and less, right? But it is in human nature, I think, all times and places to mourn the dead. And if you don't have an appropriate time on Friday evening, then you'll go back as soon as possible, which would be Sunday morning. So the way I think about it is this: if the women saw Jesus buried, it was only because they were at the crucifixion. And if they saw him buried, they knew enough that they could go back to the spot when they wanted to mourn. So I think it all fits together once you grant that there are some women in his company that are going up with him to Jerusalem. There's nothing fantastic or outlandish or unreasonable about any of this.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to bring forth is a very important aspect on the subject of these women who were there on Sunday morning. For example, the first story we have of this is the Gospel of Mark. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, the three women were not did not say anything to anybody because they were afraid. Period. You know, so I have this problem, this huge problem, because if Matthew and Luke are elaborating from Mark, uh, uh, can we take that as historical? And the second part of my question is that in the Gospel of John, there is even hints of elaborations. So, for example, when Mary Magdalene alone goes to the grave and finds it empty, she goes to the disciples and then she talks in plural. You know, we didn't find the body, you know. And that reminds me a lot of what Mark Goodacre calls um, uh, editorial fatigue. You know, that there was some earlier version of the story that included more women.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, there is also a criticism by some feminist scholars. You know, Emilia Levine, she criticizes a lot this idea that women could not be witnesses. Well, she says, well, could not be witnesses in court, you know, but by telling other people, you know. Uh, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's invalid if they tell somebody else. So.
No. I agree, and she's right. There are some papyri, and there's a Dead Sea Scroll fragment where it appears that women can testify in certain settings or for certain events. It's not a question of whether women could testify officially in court, and it's not a question of whether your little group believes women. It's you because they may be part of your group and you trust them as well as anybody. It's the fact that this is how you're presenting yourself in public when you tell your stories, and you're just telling a story about a woman or women. And again, if you look at the Gospels as a whole, I think it's fair to say that even in Luke, women are not front and center. Women tend to be in the background. Women tend to be second-class citizens, if you will. And it is out of accord, I think, with the rest of the narrative to have so much hinge upon them. As for the comment about they said no one to anything. So what does that mean? Does that mean they said no one to anyone and then they dropped dead? They never said anything? Does it mean they never said anything for a day or two, or until they told the evangelist who got the story from them? There is a parallel to this at the end of Mark 1. We don't need to go into that, but there's somebody who doesn't say anything to anyone except for the priest. And the question is, does the text assume don't say anything to anyone except for the disciples? They've just been told what they should do. So maybe the narrative assumes that. So again, this is part of the problem of the whole thing, isn't it? So if you look at the secondary critical literature, you'll find multiple interpretations of Mark 16:8 and what it means. I do find it myself weird to think that the meaning is they went away and they never told anyone anything until they dropped dead. That just can't be the case. So what that means is you have to interpret it contextually. And I think contextually, you have no reason to think that they didn't go and tell the disciples as they have been instructed to do. So Mark sounds awkward. Yeah, that's true. But Mark is a very puzzling text, not just at the end of Mark 16. Mark, in fact, I've been persuaded recently that Mark is probably not even a finished text for public consumption, that it's more like a set of notes, or it's putting down some sort of public teaching, but it's not polished publication form. Anyway, Mark is a puzzle all the way through.
That's very interesting, and it pains me to say that I would like to keep talking about the empty tomb all day, but in honor of your time, I think we're gonna move to the next set of questions, which is about the resurrection appearances.
Uh-huh.
And we're gonna start in the same way we started before, just asking you in general, what is your position regarding the appearances in general?
Well, so I get myself in trouble with my more conservative Christian colleagues, but I think in terms of phenomenology, these texts at points sound very much like visionary experiences. So Acts has no trouble saying that Paul's encounter on the Damascus Road was a visionary experience. And Paul does put his experience in 1 Corinthians 15 besides the others. Then when I look at these accounts, despite the fact that Jesus seems to be eating in Luke and in John 21, he pops in out of nowhere, it would seem, in these accounts. He's not walking up from a distance, and he just pops out when he leaves. He doesn't walk through the door. In Matthew, if you read it carefully, when the women come, the stone is then rolled away. It's rolled away in their presence, and the body is already gone, which means the body has dissipated, gone through the rock. It's not entered another dimension, but it's not just like you and me. If you or me were in a cave and the door was closed, you'd have to wait for the door to open to exit. That's not what's going on in Matthew. Not only that, but people don't recognize him. The two people on Damascus Road don't recognize who this guy is. Mary doesn't recognize him at first, right? In John 20. And then there is this recurrent note of doubt, which is in all four Gospels. It's really interesting. What the heck? If Adrian walks into the room, it's Adrian. I don't have to. It's just Adrian, right? So what is going on here? And if I look at these things and add them up, and then if I know the literature on apparitions, and there actually is an interesting phenomenological critical literature on apparitions, on people and their ostensible encounters with the recently departed. If you look at that literature, you will see all sorts of parallels between what I just observed in the Gospels. Not only that, but when apparitions speak, they tend to speak very short sentences. There aren't long conversations. That's true in the Gospels. We don't get these long conversations until later Christian texts. So in the book, I added all these up and I said, these are visionary-like experiences. And since I know visionary experiences are real, apart from the cause, apart from what you make of them, apart from whether you think they can ever be more than subjective or hallucinations in the derogatory sense, phenomenologically, I think what lies behind these accounts in the New Testament are visionary experiences. It's even the case that if you look at this literature, you will find, as weird as it is, that most ghosts are not see-through, insubstantial things. That's not what most people report. What most people report is something that's real and often seemingly solid. That is, whatever the explanation, they will say, I hugged my husband, or I felt him and he was real. Or I found multiple accounts where people will say, it was just like Jesus in the Gospels. He was real. I could touch him, and so on. So that's the first part. I think that visionary experiences lie behind these accounts or some of these accounts. Then the next question, of course, will depend on your worldview. And I think it will depend on either your ideas about the Christian religion or your ideas about apparitions in general. I'm somebody who, for reasons I suppose we can't go into here, I think not all apparitions are hallucinatory, that sometimes they are responses to incoming data. It's all very mysterious and all very strange to me. But if you allow that, then you've allowed for the possibility that the disciples didn't just hallucinate. But I don't see any way to prove that. I don't know how to demonstrate that Mary was really seeing Jesus as opposed to hallucinating him. Or the same thing with Paul. People try to construct these arguments just as they, try to prove Paul was an epileptic and somehow that will explain what happens. I think we just have to recognize that as historians, these texts are relatively thin and they're not going to prove I don't think they prove the apologist's case, but I don't think they prove the skeptic's case. I don't think these texts are strong enough to base a worldview on, or to reject on which to reject a worldview. I think these are ancient texts. We only have fragments, and this may be very frustrating, but there are lots of things we just don't know. And it's really hard, isn't it? Isn't it really hard to say, I think I can get back to somebody's to Mary's personal experience and judge what it was? I don't see how to do that. But your worldview will guide you here. So if you're very confident that all hallucinations or apparitions or ghosts or whatever you want to call them, if they're all subjective, if your worldview supports that notion or demands that, then it's just case closed, and that's going to be the end of it. And I don't think there's enough in the Gospels to push back on that. I think maybe there's enough stuff elsewhere outside the Gospels to push back on the notion that all hallucinations are just hallucinations. But the Gospels themselves aren't going to do that.
Yeah, one of the things that are very tough for many skeptics to understand is that to basically seek an alternative explanation or natural explanation is not to deny the phenomenological dimension. I mean, many people do experience these extraordinary events, for them, at least extraordinary. Uh, but at the same time, and this is my concern as a philosopher of science. For example, one of the things we do in philosophy of science is to point out the methodological naturalism, as a method for science. And that can be, and in my opinion, it can be applied to history. That does not mean that adopting the method means that necessarily there is no supernatural anything, you know, just a method for having a fruitful discipline. So, how do you how do you accept or reject this view of methodological naturalism in regarding these apparitions or visions? That for you are not complete hallucinations, etc.
So I think this comes down, maybe you can correct me, but I think this comes down to a worldview question. And so I suppose as a historian, I typically operate as a naturalist. But then I come to certain things and I'll just say, well, I don't know about this, and it might be something really strange. But here's the problem for me. And if you, Pedro, so you call yourself a skeptic, is that right? Okay, so I'm not a skeptic, and my worldview is radically different than yours, I would guess. So I personally think, I would actually say, I know. You would object and say, I don't know. But I would say, I know that all sorts of things that have no space or room within contemporary science are true. So I think that the evidence for clairvoyance or precognition or telekinesis or telepathy, I think the evidence for all those is robust. And I live in a world in which those things are actually fairly common. That makes me very different than somebody else. So if there is, I don't know, an extraordinary healing in the Gospels, right? First of all, as a historian, I'm likely to say, well, I can't really evaluate this because I can't get back there. It's just a one-time event. Maybe we only have one source for it. I don't know what to think. But since I think from the study of modern cases that there are extraordinary healings, again, I actually think they're fairly frequent, and there are quite a few things that don't fit science. Even if there is no God, I still think that. All right? I'm not talking about agent. Same thing with prophecy, precognition, and all these other things. They have nothing to do with God or my religion. I'm simply judging these, right, empirically. Now, you may say I'm wrong. We can have a big argument about that. But I'm starting with a very strange, non-materialistic worldview, right? And I believe that it's been established apart from my religious convictions, so that if tomorrow I were to become an atheist, I would still have the convictions I just shared with you, because I think they are empirically established rather than, just the product of my faith or wishful thinking, or they are correlates of my theology or something like that. So if you have your worldview, then I think you have to say what you say. That is, skepticism entails skepticism, and naturalism entails naturalism, unless the evidence is so completely overwhelming. Now, I personally don't think that the resurrection stories or the New Testament supplies anything that should destroy a secular or a naturalistic or materialistic worldview. I just don't think so. I think there are events in history, and you and I guess, would have to disagree on this. I think the evidence that a guy named Joseph of Cupertino, who's a saint back there in the 17th century, I think the evidence that he levitated is overwhelming, just completely overwhelming. Those levitations took place in a religious context. People attributed them to God. I don't attribute them to God. I have no idea what was going on, except I think this guy sometimes, actually, I think he floated a lot of times. Okay, so that just tells you how weird and strange my worldview is. So when I look at the New Testament and I see strange things, sometimes I'll say, I think that's a legend, and I'll give reasons for it. But other times I'll say, well, given how strange my worldview is, maybe that happened. But usually I can't go beyond that. Usually I can't go beyond maybe, because again, these sources are not robust. So that we have modern events. The favorite example, at least up here in North America, is the Kennedy assassination. So somebody killed President Kennedy. Who did it? Was there really one lone gunman? Well, we have movies, we have hundreds of witnesses, we have people on the spot, and we still disagree and can't get it straight, right? And I've read books after which I've said, my gosh, I don't know what to think of this, right? Maybe something happened that the Warren Commission said didn't happen or whatever. my point is, even with something that took place in front of cameras with all sorts of people, we're still not sure. I'm not sure anyway, what exactly happened. I still have questions and puzzles. Given that, how weird is it to look at 4 or 5 texts that were written by people with a personal investment in a certain take on the story, right? And that's all we have. And Mark 16 is 8 verses. Come on, that's our earliest source. That's really terrible compared to what we have for the Kennedy assassination. So again, I'm not with my more conservative friends on this one. I think if you're going to say you believe in the resurrection of Jesus, it's not going to be for historical, critical reasons. I just don't think that skeptics should read the New Testament, say, yeah, my worldview has been destroyed because I can't explain this stuff. I don't think that's what's going on.
Just a little reminder to my fellow skeptics that skepticism, more than a worldview, is a procedure. Is trying to test something, and the thing is that even someone like James Randi could say, I cannot prove that the supernatural doesn't exist. I can only offer alternatives, maybe testing, but that's basically it. So I can respect your worldview even as a skeptic. Okay.
Okay.
I very much like the idea of, and this might be a little bit off topic, but okay, the idea of a Bayesian sort of model of cognition where you have your initial probabilities of something, and then you have an event, and then that updates whatever probabilities you thought that you had, and it's all going to depend a lot on what your initial probabilities of something is.
Oh yeah, so that's the problem. That's the problem with Bayesian stuff. Is it works. The equation works, but everything depends upon the numbers that you stick in at the beginning. And people are going to have radically different ideas of what those numbers are if you're talking about historical events in the past. So maybe I'm wrong. I read a criticism of myself last week, which said I should pay more attention to Bayesian analysis. But Bayesian analysis doesn't give you the initial numbers. You still have to come up with the initial numbers somehow. And so I think we're still stuck back with where we are anyway, at least with historical events.
Yeah. I mean, if I were to tell you that there's a squirrel in your backyard, then I'll just take my word for it. But if I were to tell you there's an elephant in your backyard, then you probably want to have some hard proof.
Yeah.
But that depends on what kind of stuff you think is reasonable for it to be in your backyard. I mean, if someone tells me there's an iguana in your backyard, well, in here in Ecuador, there's iguanas everywhere, so that's fine. But I assume if I were to tell you that, then you probably want a little bit more robust evidence. So yeah, it's really hard to when you have this interplay of probabilities. It's sometimes very hard to disentangle all of this.
I agree. I don't think being a good mathematician is going to replace historians.
Yes, I remember Bart Ehrman pointing out that through Bayesian analysis,
yes, I agree too.
someone can prove that the resurrection happened, and according to the same Bayesian equation, you can prove that Jesus didn't exist.
Yes, that's right.
It depends on the premises. It depends on the premises of how you use the theorem.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. One of the more interesting things I've seen in your book is that a lot of people start with the assumption, the hidden premise, that whatever visions or appearances that happened, they were all the same. That whatever that Paul saw was probably the same thing that Peter saw. That was probably the same thing that James and the 500. Mm-hmm. And you, I think very rightly, you say that there is no reason to believe that. You actually make a typology of 4 kinds of of visionary experiences that probably were experienced by all the Christian communities.
So it's humility is a good thing, but I think I'm the first person to think of this obvious or to make this obvious observation. So here's the thing. Typically, these texts have been approached by skeptics and by apologists. And Christians are going to assume that they're all Jesus. And skeptics are going to assume that they're all nothing. But if you don't start in one of those two places, you're right. It's quite possible that it's possible in theory, isn't it, that Paul really saw Jesus and that Mary hallucinated. There's no demand that you have one explanation for these multiple events. Or maybe the 12 really saw Jesus and the 500 just saw some cloud formation, that happened to come by. So, yeah, I think so. And you're right. I think there are different kinds of visions. Phenomenologically, there are different kinds of visions. And it's really important to pay attention to these. I worked really hard in that book. I probably failed completely to break this notion that there are visions and either they're all from God or they're all hallucinations. I just think that's really simplistic and strange and sort of a leftover from theological debate.
One of a very interesting theory that you mentioned, and I think that John Mayer also mentioned, and probably other scholars too, is that it's kind of strange that Peter's vision sort of is missing, right? It's not in our New Testament, but there's that possibility that Peter's calling in Luke might actually be that an earlier recount of that vision. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that the connections between Luke 5, the calling of Peter in Luke, and John 21, I think those connections are sufficient to indicate that's the same story in two different forms. And so somebody has moved it from the pre-resurrection period to the post-resurrection period, or from the post-resurrection period to the pre-resurrection period. Or you started with two different stories and somehow they've contaminated each other. But if I had to guess, I would guess that somewhere behind Luke 5 and John 21 is a story of Peter's encounter. But both accounts are highly written up. And so I don't really know what to do with them, except I have that suspicion. But there's another suspicion that I have, and it is this. Peter's vision may not be narrated because that's all it was. So if you look at accounts, modern accounts of apparitions or encounters with the dead, many of them are very short and nothing is said and nothing happens. You just see somebody and they're there for 2 or 3 seconds and then they're gone. So if that had happened to Peter, there actually would be no story. So I don't know that happened, but it's possible there's no story because there is no story. That is, there was nothing beyond, I saw Jesus. Then he wasn't there. But you're right. It's I think in the book I suggested or cataloged 5 or 6 different explanations of why this story disappeared, if it disappeared, which it may not have disappeared. But I think it occurred to me only after I had written the book that maybe there's no story because there was no story, or it would have been a lousy story, a 1-sentence story. Peter saw Jesus. That's it. End of sentence. No story.
Well, that's kind of what happens at the end of Luke, right? He says, "Oh, he appeared to Peter," and there's it's off camera, and there's nothing, and that's it.
Yeah, it's very strange, because Paul has an appearance to Peter in 1 Corinthians 15. But maybe Peter didn't tell the story because there was no story.
Okay, we're going to be moving. This is very, very interesting, but we really want to be respectful with your time. So we're going to be moving to the last part of the interview, which is about these interesting parallels that you found between the resurrection stories and stuff that has happened in other contexts. And I want to start with this idea of the rainbow body. And I think that most of our listeners don't have any clue what the rainbow body is. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
So the rainbow body is something that purportedly happens within Tibetan Buddhists. And the gist of it is that an adept or a master, somebody who has reached a higher state of consciousness, will die. And within a few days, the body is gone, or in some cases, the body has shrunk. And by the way, there are some pictures of shrunken corpses. I have no idea what to make of them. They come from Tibet, of these shrunken corpses. There are also stories of corpses disappearing, and they leave hair and fingernails. There are also stories of bodies disappearing entirely. So when I discovered this, I thought, well, how interesting. And in my first long chapter in a book called Resurrecting Jesus, I just put this in a footnote because I didn't know what to think about it. But then after that book and before the publication of my big book on resurrection, I spent a lot of time looking at Tibetan sources, all of course in translation. I don't know Tibetan. And talking to some people who were familiar with Tibetan Buddhists and so on. And I discovered this is an ongoing tradition. At least two of them have happened supposedly in the 21st century. And the body disappears, and then the adept has attained rainbow body. That term is used because a rainbow will appear close to where the individual died. And then sometimes this is followed by encounters, ostensible encounters with the master, between the master and disciples. And the master will say a few things. So I thought, okay, I've never been to Tibet. I have an open mind. I have no idea what this is. Maybe it's all bunk and nonsense, or maybe it's not. And in that chapter, I say, I don't know what to make of this. But it seems to me that if it's all nonsense, it's really important, because here you can see people making up stories about missing bodies and encounters with dead masters in our own time. We should look into this. We should document it, figure out what's going on, and so on. On the other hand, if there is anything to some of these stories, wouldn't that be interesting also? So the chapter is a completely hypothetical take on this, because again, I don't know what to make of this. There are some people who have attempted to study this in recent times, but their results don't help me figure out really what is going on. So that's it. And I think that Christian apologists who are always talking to skeptics and saying, you have to have an open mind, you have to have an open mind, you have to listen to our arguments and so on, are very close-minded when it comes to rainbow bodies, because they don't want any of this to be true. I'm just saying, let's look at this as a parallel, history of religions parallel, and what can we learn from it? So it's hypothetical. It's what would follow if all these stories are false and just being generated, by people who are eyewitnesses and said they were there and saw it and so on. And what would follow if, maybe there's something to this.
At the risk of perhaps offending some of our Christian listeners, but it seems to me that at least some of these stories of the rainbow body if we go by historical criteria, they're better attested than the New Testament.
Well, maybe. So I think if you were to look into these, you could probably make them as well attested or better. Yeah. But again, most of these are single attested stories. There are some from recent times that have more than one witness to them, but the witnesses tend to be rather coy, and they're not really thrilled about sharing things with Western investigators or Western journalists and so on. So I've been criticized for taking this phenomenon seriously, which is a mistake. I'm simply saying this is a parallel in certain respects. Shouldn't we explore it carefully and figure this out if possible? And so it's just a call for people who know more than I do, for people who have a Tibetan language to look into this. I do have contacts within Tibetan Buddhism. I do know that they don't think of these stories as metaphors. They think of them as literally, historically real, and they are tied to people who have lived in recent times. And the Dalai Lama, for example, went on record a few years ago saying that, he knew about one of these and he thought it was real. So that's not a chain of legend over centuries. That's actually some community who thinks something has happened in their midst. I think it's really interesting. I wish we knew more about it. I don't know more about it.
The other really interesting, I don't know to call it a parallel, but the other really interesting event that you mentioned in your book is the appearances of the Blessed Virgin Mary at Zaytun. How do you connect this with the idea of the resurrection?
So that's a very well-known story, and if you talk to Coptic Christians who were alive in Cairo in the late 1960s or early 70s, they all know about this. They all accept it as a real event and phenomenon. It is very strange, and since I'm not committed to, I don't have a Marian theology, I look at this event and I say, well, I have no idea what to do with this. So I have read attempts to explain this away. None of them have been even close to plausible, earthquake lights and so on. This is something that was seen over a period of months. It was photographed. It was seen by Christians, by Muslims, by secular people, by journalists. And it was this light that would appear at the dome of this particular church in Zaytun, which is a suburb of Cairo. And it was investigated. The city actually pulled the plug on the electrical plant that supplied electricity, just to check. And that didn't stop this. There wasn't anybody inside the building with a generator doing this. This wasn't some sort of laser show. I just think this is a mass event which took place in modern times, which is very well documented. If you have a particular worldview, that is, if you are Roman Catholic or a Coptic Orthodox, you'll say this was Mary. If you're like me, you'll look at it and you'll say, what the heck was that? I don't know. I'm simply mystified. I have no explanation for this. There's actually a book. I've seen the pre-publication manuscript. There's a book that's coming out, I hope next year, but it's on Zaytun. And the argument isn't that this was an appearance of Mary. It was an argument that we have no explanation for whatever this is that happened. So for me, this is a lesson that historians can't resolve everything. At least to my knowledge, this hasn't been resolved. This is a really interesting problem. How the heck do you explain this or explain it away? That There may be things in history for which we don't have an explanation, and you can fill it in with your worldview. For example, if you're Coptic Orthodox, and you'll think this is Mary. If you don't have a worldview that says it's Mary, then you'll step back and say, I don't know what that was, or you'll try to come up with an explanation for it within your worldview. But I'm just puzzled. I'm totally puzzled by this. I don't know what to make of it. I know it was real. I know it happened. It was documented at the time. I've talked to people who were there. I talked to the grandson of one of the guys who investigated. I don't know. I personally am inclined to think this is like Joseph of Cupertino's levitations, which means I do think there are things that I don't know how to explain that have taken place within history.
Yes. Even in my camp, in skeptics, in the camp of skeptics, we have had to revise a lot regarding that apparition. Because, for example, the one you mentioned about the earthquakes and light earthquakes, that's nonsense from a scientific standpoint. However, for example, in the case of pictures, many of them are actually illustrations. Many of the pictures that are published and you can see online are were presented originally as illustrations reproducing what the witnesses said they saw, not the actual pictures of that happening. And that is very important to account. But for example, in my case, I've seen studies of anthropology and other things about that apparition, and they satisfy me somewhat. And like you, I'm not completely satisfied with what happened or the explanations being
Mhm.
offered about what happened. And one of the things we have to learn as skeptics and also believers, etc., is that it's not bad to say, I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't know. Let's explore it. So I think that's a very valid point that you bring. Of course, I'm going to pull more to the naturalistic side of things, but that does not mean that we cannot explore it from different standpoints.
Yeah, and I personally think you and I, when we argue about this or other things, need to construct public arguments as much as possible, arguments that I can evaluate and that you can evaluate and that are common to our presuppositions. If I just say I'm a Christian and I believe this because, and that's the end of it, that doesn't help us at all. We need to be able to talk and to argue and to do public arguing, I hope.
Yeah, sharing a common ground at least.
Yes, or find out as much common ground as we can, right?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
very important.
All right, that pretty much covers all that we were planning on covering. I don't know if Pedro, do you have any questions, any any leftovers from the interview?
So for now, those are the questions I wanted to make. I'm very honored to be here, and I hope that this is repeated somehow. That we continue this dialogue, this conversation. Uh, so I don't know
On,
if
on
you
my
want to say anything else.
on my part, I just want to thank you again, Professor Allison. This has been wonderful, and uh, your book is amazing. I've read it twice already, and it's probably going to be a third reading coming soon. But yeah, no, amazing scholarship and very fluid, very lucid, and very honest.
Well, thank you so much. I've
Yeah,
enjoyed the conversation and I've appreciated the questions and done my best to say something worthwhile.
Absolutely.
definitely. In fact, I repeat this. You have made one of the most thorough studies on the subject of the resurrection I've seen. and I recommend everyone to read your book. So,
thank you so much.
Um,
Appreciate the publicity.
yeah,
Oh, we will. We will.
all for free. Así que con esto nos despedimos de ustedes. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Espero que todo les vaya bien y que hayan aprendido mucho de esta conversación. Les veremos en otro episodio de Indagando en la Biblia.
Muchas gracias.